Okay, day 2 of STAAR review. We're going to do organism behaviors. So it's going to be overall ecology. So we're going to talk about like symbiosis. We're going to talk about population and organization. And we're also going to talk about food webs. So just the basic review, abiotic versus biotic means that biotic things or biotic factors are living things, and then abiotic factors are non-living things. So there are some examples shown here below in this diagram where abiotic factors include things like the clouds and rain, water, wind, sun, and temperature. And then biotic would be talking about the living things like the trees, animals, insects, fungi, all of those good things. So use your drawing tool or the pen tool to circle all of the abiotic factors here. Take a pause and go ahead and do that. Okay, so if you did go through this, and technically you should have circled anything that was non-living, which would be abiotic. So you'd be circling the sun, you'd be circling the rock, and you'd be circling the temperature. So let's look at how we can organize this part. So an organism is a single living thing. The next level would be a population, which would be a group of one species in the same place. So many of the same things is a population, or same type of things. Next thing would be a community, which would be multiple populations of different species that live in the same general area. And then lastly, it would be ecosystem, where it's the biotic and abiotic factors in the same general area and their interactions. So we're going from small to large, from the left side to the right side. Organism is small, right? We're talking about a single living thing. And then population is many individuals of that same type of living thing. And then community is many different populations together. And then ecosystem is the community plus some abiotic factors. What level did each student observe? I'm going to ask that you type this. You should have seen this before in our interactive notebooks, but it was a long time ago. So we're going to redo it just as an example. So Jesus sees 2 platypi swimming around. Diego sees 1 pink fish. Daniela sees fish swimming around the plants. And Jasmine sees water, which is warm, and that makes the platypi and the fish happy. So tell me the level of organization that Jesus, Diego, Daniela, and Jasmine have observed inside of this image. Take a pause and go ahead and complete that with text boxes. So what you should be seeing is that Jesus observed a population, right? He sees multiple types of a single type of species. Diego saw an organism because he only saw one of a type of organism. Daniela sees a community because she sees different categories of living organisms or different types of living organisms. And Jasmine sees a whole ecosystem because she sees not only the community, but also the abiotic factor of the temperature. Symbiosis is the close interactions between different species. And there's a bunch of different kinds that we talked about before. There are 5 in total. So let's talk about mutualism, commensalism, parasitism, predation, and competition. Now, mutualism is when organisms do things that benefit each other. So both are in benefit, so they're both happy with this kind of interaction with each other. An example would be the crocodile and the plover. The plover eats the dirty things from in between the crocodile's teeth so that the crocodile has nice, strong, clean teeth to keep grabbing food and prey. And then the plover gets a free meal out of it. In this case, since the interactions are both positive, since both are benefiting, both organisms should be marked with a smiley face. Commensalism, if you notice, is one smiley and one kind of about the situation, doesn't really care. So it's when one organism benefits and the other one is not helped or harmed. So in this case, there is a shark and a remora. So you see this thing sticking onto the shark. The shark is kind of whatever about the situation, as long as there's not too many remoras, but the remora is near the mouth because when the shark's eating, sharks are messy eaters, so those extra scraps fall straight down into the remora's mouth as free food, no effort. So the remora is benefiting, but the shark is kind of eh. And again, this is blocked, but it says when one organism benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. Parasitism, on the other hand, is when one organism, which is the parasite, lives on or inside another organism, which would be the host. And the parasite is benefiting, but the host is actually being harmed. Okay, so in this case, we would have a smiley face for the parasite and a frowny face for the host, because in this example right here, we have a caterpillar that has been infected with what is probably wasp eggs that are laid on it. And the baby wasps, when they hatch out, are going to burrow into the caterpillar and actually eat it alive from the inside out. The baby wasps and the wasp parents basically get a free food source for their babies, and the caterpillar is going to die before it can ever become a beautiful butterfly or moth that it was going to be able to. That's parasitism. Predation is pretty self-explanatory. It's when one population, aka the predators, capture and feed upon another population, which would be the prey. So here's an example of a lion catching and eating, or catching and killing and planning to eat a wildebeest. And in this case, you can clearly see that the lion is going to get food and is happy with the catch as the predator, and the wildebeest is dead. So that's not going to be a positive impact, right? That would be a negative impact on the prey. Competition is the last interaction, and that's when two organisms who can be of the same or even of different species want the same resource. So they're going to fight or sneak in order to compete with each other and get as much as they can of the resource. So here we have two barn owls fighting over a rodent food source because maybe there's not enough food to go around, so they're fighting over it. Other examples could be for mates, for water resources, for plants, for land or territory. All those things are resources that animals will want, whether they're fighting their own species for it or they're fighting a different species for it. Here, technically, both of them would be negatively impacted because you're spending energy instead of just hunting for food or just finding mates or just looking for water. You're spending some of that energy on fighting somebody else for that same resource when you guys could just be looking for it. I want you to use your drawing tool now and the pen tool to draw the faces that we just talked about for the following symbiotic relationships, right? Which ones are smiley faces? Which ones are frowny faces? Which ones are neutral faces? Which ones are maybe yeah, it's those three. So you're going to draw one for predation, you're going to draw for parasitism, you're going to draw for commensalism and mutualism. And if you just saw my accidental click, you kind of got a hint of what you're supposed to do, but use your pen tool and go ahead and do that. Here is the answer. So predation, for the predator, we should have a technically smiley face right here for getting food, and the other one's going to just be dead. It could be frowny or dead. Parasitism, the host is going to be sad because it's negatively impacted, but the parasite is going to be happy. Commensalism means one is happy and one is unaffected or doesn't care. And mutualism means that both are benefiting, so both are happy. So before we go into food webs, we're going to have to talk about what is energy. So energy is the ability to make change happen in the world. In the world, you cannot create energy or destroy it. So it's constantly brought in by sunlight and captured and then used in different forms. Then afterwards, it's released probably most commonly as heat energy back into the atmosphere. So a food chain is a route for the transfer of matter and energy through an ecosystem, but it is one direct route. So it doesn't include all of the types of organisms in that ecosystem, but one direct path. So here we have an example of carrots getting eaten by rabbits, which get eaten by foxes, which potentially get killed and eaten by lions. So the thing is that the arrow is pointing from the carrots to the rabbit. It doesn't mean that the carrot is the top predator here and it's going to go after the rabbit and chase after and eat it, right? The arrow actually indicates the direction of where the energy is going to be transferred. So the arrow is going from the carrot to the rabbit because the energy in the carrots will now be transferred into the rabbits once the rabbits eat the carrots. Same for when the rabbits get eaten by the foxes. The rabbit's energy now gets transferred to the fox, and that's what the arrows are representing. Use your pen tool, and I'm going to ask that you draw the arrows in to finish the food chain below. Okay, you're gonna go, there's a grasshopper, there's a frog, there's a python, and there's an eagle. And I'm gonna ask that you use arrows to draw out this food chain. Here would be the answers. You would have an arrow going from the grass to the grasshopper because the energy is going from the grass to the grasshopper. The energy is then going to be passed on to the frog. The energy is going to be then passed on to the python, and then lastly passed on to the eagle. So the arrows are showing that. So two categories that most organisms fall into are based on how they get their energy. One is autotrophs and one is heterotrophs. And the easiest thing is that autotrophs, like automobiles and anything that is autopiloted, do things on their own, right? So autotrophs can get their energy and break it down on their own. They acquire it from sunlight and they store as glucose. And autotrophs are mostly known as producers or plants. There are some bacteria that are autotrophs though. The other category is heterotrophs, or getting food from another source by consuming it, by drinking it. And us, for example, fall under the category of heterotrophs because we can't actually just go out in the sun and absorb the sunlight energy and use it. All you'll do is get a tan or get warm, right? So heterotrophs have to eat something or consume something in order to access energy. Autotrophs use sunlight, so they create their own energy and they are working on autopilot, like I said. These organisms are called producers and they use sunlight energy, or they can use chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis and use chemicals found in the soil or under the ocean in order to produce molecules where they store that energy, normally carbohydrates. Heterotrophs are also known as consumers. I forgot to mention that earlier. They get energy by consuming other organisms, which is where their name comes from, and they can usually be organized on what they eat. Herbivores eat herbs or plants. Carnivores eat other animals or carne, like meat. Omnivores eat both plants and animals, where omni means everything. And detritivore means it's going to eat detritus or dead things, which would be dead organic materials. Examples of detritivores could be like worms, which are eating dead things in the soil. There are 3 mistakes in this categorization. So somebody did this and they made 3 mistakes. I'm going to ask that you draw the thumbs down, drag the thumbs down to the 3 mistakes or the 3 boxes that are placed in the wrong place. Go ahead and pause after the video so you can go and do that. Life is definitely more complicated than just a simple food chain. That's why we have food webs. So a food web shows all of the possible relationships in an ecosystem at every single trophic level. And it's basically when you take a bunch of different food chains in an area and interconnect them, because food chains aren't actually realistic. So how do we label the different trophic levels on a food web? Well, we have to find the producer and we label them with the number 0. So the grass here is labeled with a 0 because that's our producer. Next, we have our step 2, which is to follow the arrow to the next organism connected to the producer, which would be technically the primary consumer. The primary consumer is going to get the number 1. So we would have a grasshopper and technically also a rabbit over here directly eats grass, and the mouse also directly eats grass. So these 2 are also going to get the label number 1, but we're going to find just one chain at a time right now. So if we see the grasshopper, we're going to follow the arrow to get the secondary consumer, which will now be labeled with the number 2. Here we can see that lizards eat grasshoppers, so they are a secondary consumer and they get the number 2. Just to be clear, anything that eats a primary consumer will be a secondary consumer. So the hawk eats a rabbit, so it can be a secondary consumer. The snake eats a mouse, so it can also be a secondary consumer. So next step is to find the tertiary consumer, which will get tertiary, the number 3. And the hawk eats the lizard, therefore the hawk can get a number 3 on it, and it is a tertiary consumer. Notice that in one food web, you can have multiple food chains. So if you had another food chain and you went 0 on the grass, 1 on the rabbit, you would get a 2 on the hawk. And it is possible, the higher up you go in a food web, that certain organisms will have multiple numbers or multiple trophic levels marked on them because they are in different food chains. They're involved in many different food chains. So the hawk would have a 2 and a 3 because there are 3 from this food chain, but there are 2 from this food chain. Okay, they're also technically a 2 from this food chain, and then they would be a 3 from this food chain. So again, the colors are coordinated. That tertiary consumer, which is going to be the third consumer, is marked with the 3. Secondary consumer is marked with the 2. Primary consumer is marked with the 1, and then the producer is marked with a 0. I'm going to ask that you in here in this food web, drag the heart to a producer. There are multiple here, but I want you to drag the heart on top of a producer. And then also drag the star to a secondary consumer. So you're going to have to find some sort of food chain within this food web and not only identify the producer and the primary consumer, but then put the star onto the secondary consumer. So pause this video and go ahead and do that. Energy pyramids are kind of explaining where the energy is going inside of a food web or inside of an ecosystem. So it's a visual representation organized by trophic levels, like we discussed, consumers and producers, right? We have producers, primary consumer, secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, quaternary consumer, and so on. That's the trophic levels, and it depicts the transfer of energy from one level to the next. So there's only 10% of energy transferred from one level to the next level. So that's called the 10% rule. And it's kind of crazy that so little energy is passed from level to level, but it also makes sense because while the organisms in each level are living and existing, they're kind of letting off energy as heat into the environment. So that's where 90% of energy is actually going. It's just wasted. So the producers will always be the bottom tier. So here we have some grasses as our producer, and they have the bottom tier because in a pyramid, that's the biggest section, and producers usually have the largest biomass. Primary consumers directly eat the producers, and in doing so, they get 10% of the energy that is normally contained inside of the producers. Okay, only 10% comes up here. Then 10% will be passed on as the secondary consumers consume the primary consumers. And then lastly, the 10% is going to be passed on as the tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers. This is the 10% rule. Now, like I just explained, what happens to that 90%? Well, it's got to go somewhere. So it's released as heat into the atmosphere. And like I said before, the way that we pass energy on through our trophic system isn't very efficient because 90% of it is getting lost. How do we calculate how much energy is at each level? Well, you're going to take the 10% rule and you're going to use it and move the decimal once to the left every time we move up one tier or one level in a food pyramid. So if you start out with 3,700 joules, which is just an energy measurement, you have 3700, and then technically there is a decimal there. When you move up one level, only 10% of that energy is passed on. So you move the decimal over 1 and you get 370 joules in the next level. And then you're going to move it one more time to go up, and there's going to be 37 joules. And then you would move it one more time for that top level consumer, and there's only 3.7 joules of energy at the very top level, which is crazy. Again, like I said, you lost so much energy because the rest is lost as heat. So you just subtract the level values. So for example, 3,700 minus 370 would be 3,330 joules that is lost as heat energy. 370 minus 37 is 333 joules lost as heat energy. And 37 minus 3.7 is 3.33 joules lost as heat energy to the environment. Adaptations are things that help organisms survive better and have higher fitness in an environment. So they increase the organism's survival and therefore increase their reproduction because you got to survive to mate, right? And they are usually geared towards a specific ecosystem or specific habitat. How are the anatomical adaptations of these two frogs different? What is the purpose of the bright coloration on frog A versus the dull mottled coloration of frog B. They have different purposes. So what are they for? Answer that for me. Now think about this. There are two plants on the surface. They're both just kind of long-leafed plants. Why might the roots be adapted to be longer in the plant on the left side? Think about what's found deep underground and why plants might want to reach down there. Take a pause and answer. Impacts on an ecosystem can cause cascading effects, right? Because we know that everything is connected in an interchangeable web. So what happens if the wildcat here goes extinct? Well, the ecosystem will become unstable because now everything that was, an ordered food chain and food web inside of this ecosystem now is going to be thrown into shambles because a food source and a predator are both gone. Biodiversity will decrease because there's just one whole less species now. The lion population is going to decrease because they lost a whole source of food. And then the rats and the rabbits that the wildcats used to eat are no longer getting hunted, so those populations will increase. Draw an up or down arrow to show what happens to the population of crickets and snakes if the frog population size decreases because they're all getting an infection and dying. So if the frog population is going down, tell me if the cricket population is going to increase or decrease. And tell me if the snake population is going to increase or decrease by putting an arrow up or down next to these two organisms. So pause and do that. So the crickets will technically be increasing because if the frogs are dying up, there's less frogs eating the crickets. So the cricket population has less predators and they will be growing as a population. The snakes, however, will be decreasing as a population because even though they do have shrews as a food source, one other half of their major food source is now gone or decreasing, so it's very scarce. So the snake population will not be able to be maintained as high and it will decrease because their food is decreasing. So let's go through some example practice problems of the rake method using the STAAR questions that you will be basically encountering throughout your test. So an organism gets energy from other organisms. 10% of the energy that is stored in the organism can be passed through to the next trophic level. Of the 90% lost, some is used for the organism processes and the rest is blank. Read and highlight the important question and answer stuff is the first step of the rake method. So we're going to go ahead and do that. 10% of the energy is a huge key that we're focusing on, a specific rule we just went over. And we're talking about passing on energy to the next trophic level. We also realized that in the question, they mentioned that 90% is lost. So it's a huge hint towards one rule. So what is the question actually asking? Well, the question is asking what is happening to that 90% of the energy that's not passed on? Well, let's dig into our knowledge and see. The 10% rule explains that 10% of energy is used by the next organism and 90% is lost as heat. So that's where our knowledge came from, or at least if you aren't really sure, you can have used the cheat sheet. So now we're going to jump to the last step and eliminate and choose the best answer. So we're eliminating the fact that the answer choice says use in reproduction because we are not talking about reproduction at all when we're talking about the energy passing on or passing into the atmosphere. We also are not talking about the energy being stored as body tissue fat or being stored as body tissue because if it was stored as body tissue, technically it would have been passed on instead of released into the atmosphere, right? So that wouldn't be 10% rule anymore. We also know it's not stored as fat, same reason as part B. So D is the correct answer because the rest is eliminated as heat and it gets lost into the environment. Let's do another one. So the first step is going to be read and highlight. So you and 4 friends go on a field trip to a natural area and wrote your observations in the table below. So this is your nature field trip and there's 4 students. Student 1 observed 10 white-tailed deer. Student 2 observed 2 blue jays, 3 northern cardinals, and 1 house sparrow eating seeds. Student 3 observed 1 snapping turtle on a rock, 2 snapping turtles near the edge of a pond, and student 4 observed 6 bullfrogs in a pond and then 30 bullfrog tadpoles hatching from eggs. Which student made observations of a community of organisms? Now, we're going to go and highlight all the important things. So the obvious important thing is the actual table where we have everybody's observations. And the really, really important key phrase that we're looking at is community. Okay, so what is the question asking? Well, we're asking which student saw a community. And we're going to use our knowledge of levels of organization to explain that community is all of the living things in an area or multiple populations. So there can be different species involved in a community. Now we're going to eliminate answers that are wrong. We're going to eliminate student 1 because student 1 saw a population, not a community, because their 10 white-tailed deer are all the same species. Student 2 is actually correct because there are multiple types of populations of different species in the observation that they wrote down. However, we also want to go through the other ones just to double check. So we want to see student 3 actually only saw snapping turtles, even though the student saw them in different locations. So that would still be a population. And student 4 also only saw population because while it says bullfrogs and tadpoles, tadpoles are just the baby versions of the bullfrogs. So it's still one population. Now you're going to go ahead and try. You're going to answer the next couple of STAAR-based questions using the rake method, where you're going to read and highlight. You're going to ask what the question is actually rephrased as. You're going to explain the knowledge that you're using to answer this question, or using the cheat sheet to help you and write that down. And then the last thing you're going to do is eliminate the wrong answers and choose the best answer. So you have a question here, and a question here. And then lastly, a question here. So you're going to go through and finish all of those, and then I will be checking that to grade for completion. And then you'll be moving on to your exit ticket, which will test how much you learned or reviewed today by giving you some more STAAR sample questions.